So today we are going to talk about the Plymouth Colony. The last week or so, we have learned about the Lost Colony, the first two attempts for the English to settle a permanent colony in the Americas, which was the Lane Colony, and then the Roanoke or the Lost Colony. And then we spent the last week or so learning about the Jamestown Colony, which was the first permanent settlement in the Americas. Perhaps the most famous of the first permanent settlements in the Americas is the Plymouth Colony because of the Pilgrims and those that settled there. And today we're going to talk a little bit about that, and maybe hopefully you'll learn some new things about the first Thanksgiving and those that lived at the Plymouth Colony. So the Plymouth Colony started out as a group of pilgrims or separatists that wanted to have religious freedom from the British or from the English. Remember, the Church of England was specifically set up, and they did not accept people that had different religious beliefs. And so the Pilgrims or the separatists had a different set of beliefs, and they wanted to go somewhere where they didn't feel like they were going to be set apart because of their specific religious beliefs. So initially, they end up moving to the Netherlands in Europe. And they spend a little bit of time there and decide that that is not the place that they want to be. So they get permission from the king to sail to the Americas and set up a permanent settlement for their religious group. So the Pilgrims set out from the Netherlands. They stopped in England along the way once they received permission to sail for the Americas from the king. They actually started out with two different ships, the famous Mayflower that I'm sure you've heard of, and they also had another ship called the Godspeed. But the Godspeed ended up being stuck in port while they were in England and never made the trip, or did not make the initial trip. When the Pilgrims made it to the Americas, the journey across the Atlantic Ocean took about 6 weeks. And what happened was they were actually sailing for Virginia. Their initial thought was that they were going to be able to go to Virginia, but because of stormy weather and bad ocean tides, and they ended up landing in what is today Massachusetts. So that is a long way from where they meant to go, about 400 or 500 miles away from where they initially were trying to go. Instead of landing in Virginia, they land in Massachusetts, what is today Massachusetts. When they get there, they realize that things are going to be very difficult. It was initially 102 settlers that arrived on the ship, the famous ship, the Mayflower, and they arrive in 1620. One of the key things to understand about this colony is that the Pilgrims were not looking to make money or to make a profit like the Virginia Company had in Jamestown. The purpose of this settlement or this colony was simply to have religious freedom. This small group of Pilgrims was looking to have religious freedom from England. Now, when they arrived, before they even got off of the Mayflower, all of the men in the group got together and they wrote a legal contract which basically said that the Pilgrims, once they got onto the land, would have fair laws and they would protect the general good of all of those in the colony. And this became known as the Mayflower Compact. And it's very important because it was one of the first attempts in the Americas, in the colonies, at having the government be run by all of the people rather than just by one or two or three people at the top. Once they arrived and they signed the Mayflower Compact and they come onto the land, the Pilgrims, much like the Jamestown colonists, struggled mightily. They had a lot of problems with figuring out how to plant crops, how to survive. In fact, initially, as they were building up their houses and their villages and their fort, The Pilgrims would actually come on the land during the day, and they would go back onto the ship at night. They would work on building up their fort and their settlement during the day on the land, and then they would sleep on the Mayflower at night. And the first winter was very difficult for them. It was cold. They were not able to protect themselves well. They didn't have a lot to eat. In fact, roughly half of the Pilgrims died through that first winter. Um, and so, as I mentioned, just like the Jamestown settlement, the beginning of this settlement, they get off to a very rocky start, and people are questioning whether or not they should be here in the first place after that first winter. Well, what happens? The Native Americans come to the rescue, and one Native American in particular, his name was Squanto, and you see a picture of him here. And Squanto, he helped the Pilgrims in a specific way. And maybe you have heard the phrase before, if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, but if you teach a man to fish, you feed him for his entire life. Well, Squanto kind of practiced this. The Pilgrims had no idea how to fertilize their crops, and Squanto showed them that if you take a dead fish carcass and you put that in the ground with your seed for your corn or whatever crop you're planting, that's going to fertilize the seed and help it to grow much better. And Squanto also taught the Pilgrims how to catch fish, especially eel, which were prominent in the area, as well as some of the shellfish like lobsters and oysters and things like that. Squanto also acted as a trade partner, and he helped the Pilgrims establish friendly relationships with the local Native American tribe, which was called the Wampanoag. And these friendly relationships would help the early Pilgrims, would help them kind of survive until they could start to grow and prosper more. Now, were they friendly with the Native Americans all the time? No, absolutely not. Most of the early English settlements in the Americas had some confrontations with the Native Americans, but Squanto did a great job of helping them to kind of bridge that gap and be friendly with each other. And this would lead to the first Thanksgiving. Now, when we have Thanksgiving in the Americas, we picture something like excuse me, something like this that you see in front of you here. And in the Americas, we have Thanksgiving, and of course we celebrate Thanksgiving with turkey and football and families getting together, and it's a time where we give thanks for all of the things that we have in our lives. Well, the first Thanksgiving was probably not quite like that. In fact, some of the things you may have learned in elementary school about the Pilgrims and the first Thanksgiving, in fact, are just not true at all. And so when we look at this slide here, you'll see that they came together with the Wampanoag to celebrate harvest. It was their first year of harvest, and they were able to actually survive based on the things that the Native Americans had taught them on how to grow things, how to hunt, and how to fish. The menu that day for that, or it was actually not even a day celebration, it was a several days celebration, 3 or 4 or 5 days straight of a festival where things were celebrated, and they were thankful that they had been able to survive their first year in the new colony. But the menu that day did not feature turkey. As much as we have been taught that, there was probably not any turkey on the menu that day. Now there was venison or deer meat. There was also corn and shellfish like lobsters and oysters and things like that. Different roasted meats, possibly chicken, and as I mentioned, venison. And in all likelihood, there was not turkey at the first Thanksgiving. In fact, the tradition of eating turkey at Thanksgiving didn't come along until sometime in the 1800s, so about 200 to 250 years later after this first Thanksgiving. And as I mentioned already, it was more like a harvest festival than Thanksgiving. It was not a one-day event, it was a 2 or 3 day event. So, you can see on this picture this is kind of the idea of what the first Thanksgiving looked like. It looked something like this. And you can see the Pilgrims and the Native Americans kind of together there in the picture. And so I really want you to get out of this Prezi that the first Thanksgiving was not really like the Thanksgivings that we celebrate today. It was much more about the Pilgrims were thankful that they had survived a year in the Americas and that the menu was different than what we eat today. But it was ultimately about being thankful for the things that we have. So at this point, you can go ahead and take the quiz that accompanies this Prezi, and we'll see how you do.